All right, so get this. We're going to dive into the wild world of Chinese tech regulation today.
Oh, really?
Yeah, specifically, we're going to be looking at how China manages its tech giants.
Yeah.
You know, from Alibaba to Tencent. I mean, you've probably seen the headlines about, crackdowns and all these new rules they've been implementing, but trust me, there's a whole lot more going on beneath the surface.
Yeah, you're right. It's interesting to see what impact those decisions have, not just in China, but globally as well.
Exactly. And to help us kind of pick through all of this, we have Angela Huyue Zhang's new book, Highwire: How China Regulates Big Tech and Governs Its.
Yeah.
And it's really like getting a backstage pass. I mean, this book really breaks down how China is making these really critical decisions that are really shaping the future of tech.
Yeah, and this dynamic pyramid model that Zhang uses is fascinating.
Okay.
It shows how China's leaders are balancing this desire for economic growth, but at the same time really focusing on social stability and, nationalism.
So the dynamic pyramid model. Okay, what is that? Break it down for me. What are we talking about here?
So imagine a pyramid, right?
Yeah.
At
Yeah.
the very top, you've got the Chinese leadership, and they're setting these big goals, like common prosperity or technological self-reliance, these really ambitious, overarching goals.
Right, those big picture ideas that you always hear about.
Exactly.
Okay.
But here's where it gets interesting. Those goals don't always work together very well.
Okay.
So trying to achieve all of them at the same time creates this tension, this constant balancing act.
Mm-hmm.
And all that pressure trickles down to every level of the pyramid, especially when it comes to regulating tech.
So how does this tension actually, how does it play out? I mean, is it like a constant tug of war between, different factions within the government, or?
In a way, it is.
Okay.
Because in the lower levels of the pyramid, you have all the regulators.
Right.
The ministries and agencies that are responsible for taking those really broad directives from the top and actually turning them into concrete rules and enforcement.
So the top says, here's the grand vision. But then the folks below them have some leeway in how they interpret it and implement it.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
And that's where the dynamic part comes in.
Okay.
These agencies aren't robots. They're not just following orders.
Right.
They've got their own agendas, their own turf to protect.
So they're trying to, please the folks at the top, but also kind of, what's the saying, looking out for number one.
Right.
Okay, so that sounds like that's going to cause some really interesting power struggles.
It does. Sometimes they might be kind of lax in enforcement. They might turn a blind eye to certain practices if it means that the economy keeps humming along.
Okay.
But then let's say a company gets too big or a CEO criticizes the government publicly.
Uh-oh.
And suddenly the pendulum swings the other way.
And boom, crackdown time.
Exactly.
And that's when it hits the headlines.
Exactly. And those crackdowns, they seem so sudden, so arbitrary to outsiders.
Right.
But when you understand this dynamic pyramid, the pressure from the top, the agencies kind of maneuvering for power and influence, it starts to make a lot more sense.
So are there any specific examples of this, how this dynamic pyramid actually plays out in the real world?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Ant Group saga is a perfect example.
Well, yeah, that was huge. I mean, that felt like a seismic shift. Jack Ma, the founder, he makes a couple of critical remarks about financial regulators, and boom, their IPO gets completely torpedoed.
Right. And, this is where Zhang's book is so insightful.
Okay.
It wasn't just about what Ma said. It was about how those comments played into this whole web of competing priorities and bureaucratic maneuvering within that dynamic pyramid.
So it's like his comments accidentally kicked over this anthill, and then everybody scrambles to kind of react in a way that protects their own.
Exactly.
Got it.
Because financial regulators, they're just like any other agency in this system. They're always trying to prove their worth to the top.
Yeah.
They want to show that they're in control. They're aligned with those overarching goals like common prosperity and social stability.
And common prosperity in this context means what exactly?
Yeah, so basically it's this idea that economic growth should benefit everybody, not just a select few.
Right.
So it's about reducing inequality, making sure that there's social harmony.
Okay.
So when Ma comes out and publicly criticizes financial regulations, it creates this perfect opportunity for regulators to be like, hey, look, we are serious about this. We are going to rein in these tech giants. We're going to make sure they don't get too big and powerful.
So by cracking down on Ant Group, they're basically saying see, we're the ones holding the line here.
Exactly. It's a way to assert their authority, show that they're on top of things.
Right.
And don't forget about those golden shares that the Chinese government can take in these tech companies. And give them even more leverage.
Oh, right. The golden shares. Those are those special shares that give the government, even with a small ownership stake, they still have like significant voting rights.
Exactly. It's another tool in their belt to exert control and steer these companies in a direction that aligns with, national priorities.
Interesting.
And what I find fascinating is that this dynamic pyramid model, it helps us understand not just those big dramatic crackdowns,
Right.
but also how China approaches all sorts of other tech-related issues,
Okay.
like labor regulations or data privacy.
So it's not just about like these big headline-grabbing moments. It's also about the everyday ways that the government is trying to shape the tech landscape.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
For example, the book talks about how China is dealing with this whole gig economy thing.
Right, which is a huge deal.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hot topic everywhere right now.
Yeah, for sure.
And, they're having very similar debates about algorithmic control and worker rights.
So even in a system that seems so tightly controlled from the top, there's still room for these kinds of debates and adjustments.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so interesting. Like Zhang talks about how platforms like Meituan, which is that huge food delivery giant,
Right.
they're being pressured to kind of tweak their algorithms to give drivers more flexibility and, better working conditions.
Interesting. So it's like they're trying to find that sweet spot where they can keep, the delivery economy humming, but also address the concerns about, worker exploitation and all that.
Exactly. And that pressure is coming from both sides.
Yeah.
Okay. From the government and from the public, which, again, highlights those competing priorities.
Yeah, makes sense. What about data privacy, though? Because, I mean, that's a huge deal everywhere, but especially in China, with these massive tech companies collecting just mountains of data. I mean, that's a tough one to balance, right? Because you have these massively powerful companies sitting on just mountains of data, and then you have a government that wants to be able to control where that data flows, but also wants to, they want to encourage a thriving digital economy.
All right, it's all about control.
Yeah.
Right. One of the main goals is to make sure that the data that's being generated in China stays in China.
Okay.
There's a lot of concern about that information going to other countries,
Right.
especially if it's sensitive.
Yeah.
Could impact national security.
So they're building like a digital fortress around their data?
Yeah, kind of. They've put all these really strict regulations in place, like the cybersecurity law, the data security law, and those dictate how companies can collect data, store it, transfer it, which of course has huge implications for international businesses, because if they want to operate in China, they've got to, jump through all these hoops to be in compliance.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's like, on the one hand, they're cracking down on companies collecting all this data, but then at the same time, they're building these systems that could give them access to that same data.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
It's a really nuanced situation, because it's like, how do you encourage innovation but also maintain, national security and keep a certain amount of social control? And this is where like that whole dynamic pyramid thing comes in again, because you've got these, broad directives about data security, but then you have all these different agencies interpreting and implementing them, sometimes in different ways.
Yeah.
And they all have their own, agendas and internal power struggles.
So it's like navigating a maze where the walls are constantly shifting.
Pretty much. And it's something that any business that either operates in China or wants to has to deal with constantly.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, there's one more thing I wanted to touch on from the book, which is this idea of platforms decentralizing their own governance.
Oh, right.
Which seems a little counterintuitive, right? It's like, wait a minute, these platforms are voluntarily giving up some of their power.
Yeah, and it's actually a very strategic move.
Right.
It goes back to the dynamic pyramid model.
Oh, okay.
So basically, these platforms like Alibaba, for example, they're experimenting with giving users more control, more of a say in how things are run.
So what kind of control are we talking about? Like, give me an example.
So, for example, some platforms are letting users participate in, the rulemaking process.
Wow.
So they have a voice in shaping the policies of the platform.
Okay.
Others are doing these user-driven dispute resolution things.
Interesting.
So like, instead of just going through the platform's mechanisms for resolving a conflict between a buyer and a seller,
Right.
they're letting other users kind of mediate that.
So it's like they're creating these little mini democracies within their platforms.
Yeah, in a sense.
Wow.
And there are a couple of reasons for this.
Okay.
First, it helps to kind of alleviate some of the pressure they're getting from the government and the public.
Okay.
Because they can say, look, we're giving users more control, we're committed to transparency, we're being responsive.
It's like they're heading off those concerns about algorithmic bias and censorship and all that by saying, hey, look, you actually get a say in this.
Exactly. And the second reason is it's a way to kind of get ahead of more regulations. Because they can say to the government, look, we're already doing this, we take it seriously, we can self-regulate to a certain extent.
So it's a win-win. They can appease the government and, empower users all at the same time.
Exactly. And, this whole trend towards more decentralized governance.
Right.
That's something to really watch because it's still early days.
Yeah.
But it could really change how platforms, users, and regulators all interact. And not just in China. I mean, this could have global implications.
Wow, this whole conversation has been amazing. It really is so much more than just China is cracking down on tech,
Yeah.
So much more complex and nuanced than that. And this book has been so helpful in really illuminating this world that honestly can feel really opaque sometimes.
It's true. It's really complex.
Yeah.
But it's so important to understand this if you want to understand the future of tech.
100%.
Yeah.
So it's clear that this approach that China is taking, it's not just about control, it's about strategically shaping the future of their economy and their place in the world.
Right. And it brings up all these questions too, like, will this actually work long term?
Right.
How is this going to impact global competition? What happens to individual freedoms and rights in this whole digital age? I mean, these are questions that we're all going to be wrestling with for years to come.
For sure. And these are conversations that we're going to keep having. So thank you so much for helping us break all of this down.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Anytime.
And for everyone listening, if you want to go even deeper, I highly recommend checking out Angela Huyue Zhang's book, Highwire, because it's really eye-opening. All right. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.